The stranger had just stepped onto the sidewalk when something small touched his hand. Not money. Not fear. A piece of candy. The little girl stood there trembling, holding it out like a promise she couldn't afford to break. What she said next made the people around him tense, and made a man feared across the city go completely still. No one ever spoke to him first. When he appeared, conversations stopped. People turned away, crossed the street, pretended not to see. But this little girl didn't move. Her pink shirt was damp from the cold. Her eyes were red, her lips shaking as she held out the candy with both hands. Sticky, half-melted, clearly saved for too long. "It's for you," she whispered. "It's all I have." The men behind him reacted instantly. One step forward, then another. He stopped them without turning around. When he lowered himself to her height, his face gave nothing away. No anger, no mercy. "Why give this to me?" he asked. The girl took a breath like she'd practiced this moment 100 times. "Because they said you're the only one they're scared of." Her voice cracked. She leaned closer. "And if I tell anyone else, my mom won't come back." Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The rain over Seoul didn't just fall. It felt like it was trying to wash the sins off the concrete, though men like Yoo Sang-chul knew some stains were permanent. He sat in the back of the black sedan, the leather upholstery smelling of expensive tobacco and old power. Outside the tinted glass, the neon signs of the Gangnam district blurred into streaks of electric blue and violent red. To the world, this was a city of technology and progress, but to Sang-chul it was a clockwork machine of debt and discipline. He was the one who kept the gears turning. As the car glided toward the curb of a high-end club, the atmosphere on the sidewalk shifted instantly. It was a phenomenon his men called the Great Silence. The rowdy drunkards suddenly found their balance and hurried in the opposite direction. Street vendors lowered their heads, busying themselves with phantom tasks. Even the rain seemed to hit the pavement with less noise. Sang-chul didn't need to shout to be heard. His presence was a heavy, suffocating weight that commanded the space around him. The door was opened by an aide who didn't dare make eye contact. Sang-chul stepped out, his handmade Italian shoes clicking sharply against the wet asphalt. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, his movements precise and devoid of wasted energy. This was the emperor of the night in his element, a man who lived by a single unbreakable golden rule: order above all. In Sang-chul's territory, there were no chaotic street brawls or messy displays of cruelty. He ran the syndicate like a sovereign nation. You paid your dues, you kept your word, and you never ever targeted those who couldn't defend themselves. To Sang-chul, a leader who preyed on the weak wasn't a boss. He was a vulture. And vultures were meant to be hunted. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the deserted entrance of the club. His bodyguards stood like stone pillars, their hands hovering near their jackets, scanning for threats that rarely dared to manifest. Sang-chul took a deep breath of the metallic, rain-soaked air. He had spent 20 years building this fortress of fear and respect, sacrificing his sleep, his youth, and his conscience to ensure that when he walked down a street, the world stepped aside. He was a man who expected the predictable: a bow from the manager, a report on the week's collections, and perhaps the silent removal of a rival who had overstepped. He was prepared for bullets, for betrayals, and for the cold business of power. He was prepared for everything the dark world could throw at him. But as he turned toward the club's heavy gilded doors, a flash of movement caught the corner of his eye. A small sodden shadow detached itself from the mouth of a nearby alleyway. It wasn't a rival. It wasn't an assassin. It was a little girl in a pink shirt, her hair plastered to her forehead, stepping directly into the path of the most dangerous man in the country. For the first time in a decade, the Emperor of the Night felt the rhythm of the city falter. The clockwork machine had skipped a beat. The heavy silence that usually followed Sang-chul's arrival shattered. His lead bodyguard, a broad-shouldered man named Kim, moved with instinctive violence, his hand reaching for the inner lining of his coat to intercept the intruder. But Sang-chul raised a single finger, and Kim froze mid-step, his boots skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The men behind him remained like statues, their eyes darting between the alley and the small, trembling figure now standing in the center of the sidewalk. Minacio looked like a ghost of a child. Her pink shirt was heavy with rainwater, clinging to her small frame, and her shoes, canvas sneakers decorated with faded flowers, were caked in mud. She was shivering so violently that her teeth clicked together, a rhythmic sound that seemed louder than the falling rain. In her right hand, she gripped something small and colorful, her knuckles white from the pressure. Sangchul didn't move. He looked down at her from his height, his face a mask of cold granite. He had faced down prosecutors, rival kings, and hitmen without blinking. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about the way this child looked at him. She didn't have the hollow stare of the broken or the frantic eyes of the desperate. She looked at him with a terrifying, singular hope. Slowly she extended her arm. Her hand was small and red from the cold, shaking as she opened her palm. Resting in the center was a single crumpled strawberry candy, its wrapper sticky and translucent under the neon lights. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was thin, catching on a sob that she was clearly trying to swallow. They said you're the one who decides what happens here." Sangchul looked from the candy to the girl's tear-streaked face. "Who told you that?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "The men who took her," Minacio said, a fat tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. "They came to our house. They broke the door. They told my mommy she had to go with them because of the interest. I tried to hold on to her, but they pushed me." She wiped her nose with her sleeve, her breath coming in ragged hitches. One of them laughed. He pointed toward this street and said if I wanted her back, I'd have to ask the king. He said the king takes everything. She took a step closer, braving the wall of dark-suited men who loomed like monsters around her. She held the candy higher, offering it to Sangchul's chest. "This is all I have," she choked out. "I saved it for my birthday, but I don't want it. I want my mommy. Please, I'm hiring you to bring her home." The bodyguard shifted uncomfortably, their eyes downcast. There was a cruel irony in the situation that wasn't lost on them. They were the ones who usually took, they were the ones who enforced debts. But this child was offering a piece of sugar as a retainer for a man whose time was valued in millions of won. Sangchul looked at the candy. In the reflection of the wet wrapper, he saw the distorted image of his own face, hard, scarred, and distant. He thought of his golden rule. He thought of the clean business he prided himself on. If debt collectors were snatching mothers off the street in his district and using his name to mock a child, it wasn't just a kidnapping. It was an insult to his crown. He reached out. His large, calloused hand eclipsed hers as he delicately took the small candy from her palm. The sugar was sticky, the wrapper cheap, but he held it as if it were a heavy coin. "A contract has been made," Sangchul said, his voice turning into something sharper, something dangerous. He didn't put the candy in his pocket. He held it tightly in his fist, feeling the sharp edges of the plastic. The rain continued to pour, but the air around him had changed. The emperor was no longer heading to a club for a drink. He was going to war over a piece of strawberry candy. The silence in the cramped apartment felt heavy, like the air right before a summer thunderstorm. Minacio sat on the edge of the frayed sofa, her small hands gripped tightly in her lap. She didn't look like a child who had just asked for a miracle. She looked like a soldier who had run out of ammunition and was looking for a new weapon. I watched her for a long moment, the weight of her request pressing against my chest. "Minacio," I said softly, leaning forward so I was closer to her level. "Why me? I'm just a guy who lives down the hall. I'm not a hero. I'm not even someone who knows how to handle whatever this is." She finally looked up, her eyes bright with a mixture of unshed tears and a terrifyingly adult level of resolve. "I tried a Jushi," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I went to the police station 3 blocks away. I waited for 2 hours until an officer would listen to me. He just patted my head and told me that sometimes parents have loud arguments and that I should go home and be a good girl." She let out a shaky breath. a sound that carried far too much exhaustion for a 10-year-old. Then I asked Mrs. Park downstairs. She saw the bruises on Mom's arm last week. She just looked at the floor and said she didn't want any trouble, that it's a family matter. Everyone looks away. They see the shadows under our door, and they just walk faster. I felt a surge of cold anger, not at her, but at the world that had left her so isolated. This wasn't just a neighborhood of thin walls. It was a neighborhood of closed eyes. The police are afraid of the paperwork or the mess or whatever he tells them, Minacio continued, her gaze dropping back to her white-knuckled grip. And the neighbors are afraid of him. They've seen him in the hallway when he's like that. They're afraid because they're small. She stood up then, walking over to where I sat. She looked at my hands, calloused and scarred from years of labor, and then up at my shoulders. I'm asking you because you're the biggest, she said simply. Not just because of your size. Because when you look at me, you don't look away. You're the only one who doesn't look like they're waiting for me to disappear. The honesty in her voice was sharper than any blade. She wasn't flattering me. She was stating a desperate logistical fact. In her world of shadows and predators, I was the only mountain she could find to hide behind. I thought of my own past, the reasons I had moved to this anonymous concrete block to begin with, seeking a silence of my own. I had spent years trying to be invisible, trying to ensure no one ever needed anything from me again. But looking at Minacio, I realized that my invisibility was a luxury she couldn't afford. They won't come back, will they? She asked, her voice dropping to a tiny, fragile thread. If he sees you there, he won't hurt her tonight? I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a badge or a weapon. All I had was the sheer mass of a man who had nothing left to lose and a sudden burning need to be the person she thought I was. The biggest person in her world wasn't a high bar to clear, given how much everyone else had shrunk, but it was a responsibility that settled onto my shoulders with the finality of a lead shroud. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet room. I reached out, hesitating for a second before resting a hand lightly on her head. Not a patronizing pat like the officer, but a steadying weight. Stay here, I said, my voice sounding deeper, more grounded than it had in years. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. Minacio nodded, a single sharp movement. As I walked toward the door, I could feel her eyes on my back, pinning her last shred of hope to my threadbare jacket. I stepped out into the dim hallway, the flickering fluorescent light overhead humming a nervous electric tune. For the first time in a long time, I didn't look at the floor. I looked straight ahead at the door at the end of the hall, and I started walking. The heavy iron door of the safe house groaned as I stepped inside, the scent of stale cigarettes and expensive cologne instantly thick in the air. My lieutenants, men who had bled for the organization and expected a certain cold logic in return, were already waiting. They stood around the low-slung mahogany table, their faces etched with a skepticism that bordered on defiance. It's a breach of protocol, Sangchul, Kite said, his voice flat and hard. He flicked a lighter open and closed, the metallic clack echoing against the concrete walls. We don't intervene in domestic disputes in the tenements. We pay the local precinct to keep the noise down, and we stay out of the laundry. If we start playing hero for every stray kid, we lose our invisibility. We become a target for the district attorney's quality of life crusade. Young-ho, the younger of the two, nodded in agreement, leaning back against a stack of crates. He's right. The girl is a liability. Her father is a nobody, but nobodies make the most noise when they're backed into a corner. If you crack his skull, the police can't look the other way anymore. They'll have to file a report, and then our names start appearing in places they shouldn't. I didn't answer immediately. I walked to the window, looking out over the sprawl of the district. From this height, the city looked like a circuit board, glowing with a frantic artificial energy. To them, Minacio was a variable that didn't fit the equation. To them, the biggest man in the room was the one who protected the bottom line. You think this is about a family matter? I asked, turning slowly. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a spent casing hitting the floor. Kite frowned. What else would it be? I walked the hall after I sent her back. I said, moving toward the table. I threw a crumpled piece of paper onto the wood, a flyer I'd snatched from the stairwell. The man she's afraid of, the one the neighbors are too terrified to mention. He isn't just a drunk with a short fuse. He's been seen at the docks. He's been seen talking to the Namgu Syndicate's runners. The room went still. The protocol they were so worried about wasn't just about avoiding police attention. It was about territorial integrity. The Namgu group? Jung-ho straightened up, his eyes narrowing. That's our backyard. They aren't supposed to have a presence north of the bridge. Exactly, I said, leaning over the table, my shadow stretching across the maps and ledgers spread before us. The police aren't ignoring him because they're lazy. They're ignoring him because someone higher up told them to let the Namgu boys set up shop in the tenements. They're using the apartment block as a staging ground for their distribution, and this man, Minasio's father, is their foot in the door. He's the chaos they used to mask their movement. The realization shifted the air in the room. The hesitation in Kite's eyes turned into a cold, calculating hunger. This was no longer about a child's plea or a neighborly favor. This was about a breach of a different kind. If they're operating out of that building, Kite whispered, the lighter finally going still in his hand, they're mocking us. They're betting we're too distracted to notice what's happening right under our feet. They think I'm just a ghost living in 402, I said, my jaw tightening. They think the neighborhood is so broken that no one will ever stand up. They're counting on the silence. I looked at my hands, the hands Minacio had trusted because they were big. I wasn't just doing this for her anymore. Though her face remained burned into my mind, I was doing this because the enemy had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had brought their rot into the one place I had tried to keep still. We aren't following protocol tonight, I told them, my voice like grinding stone. We're reminding them whose backyard this is. Jung-ho, get the car. Kite, find out exactly how many Namgu runners are stationed in that block. I headed for the door, my heart beating with a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. A purpose that was both violent and strangely righteous. Minacio wanted the biggest man to help her. She was going to get exactly what she asked for. The stairwell of the tenement smelled of wet concrete and desperation. As I climbed the steps toward the fourth floor, Kite and Jung-ho followed a few paces behind, their footsteps silent, their presence a shadow that seemed to swallow the dim light. We didn't look like neighbors anymore. We looked like the end of a long bad dream. The door to 408 wasn't locked. It hung slightly ajar, the wood around the frame splintered from previous forced entries. I pushed it open with the tip of my boot, the hinges letting out a high thin whine that set my teeth on edge. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cheap soju and something metallic, the unmistakable scent of blood and fear. Minacio's mother, Ji-young, was slumped at the kitchen table. She didn't look up when we entered. She looked like she had forgotten how to react to intruders. Her face was a map of fading yellows and fresh purples, her left eye swollen nearly shut. On the table before her wasn't a meal, but a stack of papers, notarized documents with thumbprints in red ink that looked like small bloody wounds. Where is he? I asked, my voice low. She flinched, her shoulders hunching toward her ears. He went to get more. He says we still owe. He says the interest doubled this morning. I walked over and picked up one of the papers. It wasn't a standard bank loan, or even a typical neighborhood debt. It was a predatory contract from a front company I recognized instantly, a shell used by the Namgu Syndicate to harvest people. They didn't just want the money back. They wanted the soul of the house. The initial loan was for a hospital stay 3 years ago, a pittance, but the interest had been engineered to be unpayable. It was a tether, a way to keep the family in a state of permanent, terrified servitude. The debt is a lie, Ji-young, I said, dropping the paper back onto the table. It fluttered like a dead wing. It doesn't matter if it's a lie, she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. They have the papers. They have the men in the black jackets. If we don't pay, they said they'd take Minacio to a work school across the border. He believes them. He thinks if he works for them, if he does what they say, they'll let her stay. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me. This wasn't just about a father's rage. The man was a victim who had turned into a monster, broken by the weight of a debt that was designed to never end. He was being used as a guard dog for his own prison, and he was taking his failures out on the only people smaller than him. Kite stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room with clinical detachment. He picked up a ledger from the counter, flipping through the pages. It's a harvesting ring, Sangchul. They aren't just here for the money. They're using these apartments to scout for collateral. Children, women, able-bodied men for the docks. It's a human farm. The brutality of the math was staggering. They weren't just operating in our backyard. They were strip mining it. I looked at Ji-young, at the way she stared at the wall, waiting for the next blow. She had lived in this gray world so long she had forgotten the sun existed. She didn't even ask who I was or why I was there. To her, I was just another shadow in a life made of them. They're coming back tonight, aren't they? I asked. 10 o'clock, she breathed. To collect the service fee. My husband went to meet them at the corner. I checked my watch. 9:45. I looked at Kite and Young-ho. They didn't need orders. They saw the same thing I did. An affront to the order we maintained, a parasite trying to feed on our territory. But beneath the tactical necessity, I felt the small heavy weight of Miniso's hand on my mind. Clean the table, I told Young-ho. Get her into the other room. Close the curtains. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the small kitchen table, facing the door. I placed my hands flat on the scarred laminate, the biggest man in a very small, very broken room, waiting for the collectors to arrive. The debt they were coming to collect didn't exist, but I was about to make sure they paid one of their own. The kitchen was silent, save for the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down to a funeral. I sat in the dim light, my hands still flat on the table, feeling the vibrations of the building. Somewhere above us a pipe groaned. Somewhere below a door slammed. The atmosphere was charged, the air ionizing as if before a lightning strike. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped a single contact. I didn't need to look at the name. Some numbers are etched into the bone. Sangchul, a voice answered on the first ring. It was dry and rasping like sandpaper over wood. This was Detective Han, a man who had long ago traded his badge's shine for the pragmatic shadows of my payroll. He wasn't just a cop. He was the gatekeeper of the city's forgotten files. I need the location of the Namgu paper mill, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy stillness of the kitchen. The one handling the service fees for the northern tenements. I want the site where they keep the physical ledgers. Not the digital ghosts. The ink and blood. There was a pause on the other end. Han knew what that request meant. It wasn't an inquiry, it was a hunting license. That's a hornet's nest, Sangchul. They've got heavy protection from the district office. If you kick it, the stingers will come from all directions. Then bring a suit, I replied. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you to clear the radio channels for the next 3 hours. I have cleaners moving in. I hung up before he could argue. I turned to Kite, who was leaning against the doorframe, his silhouette sharp and predatory. Call the vanguard. I want the 3-man teams at every exit of the Namgu logistics hub in Guro. If anyone leaves with a briefcase or a hard drive, they don't make it to the main road. Kite's eyes sparked with a grim satisfaction. And the father? If he's with them, bring him back here. I want him to see what he's been serving. The cleaners weren't just thugs. They were the men who made problems disappear, the ones who scrubbed the reality of the streets until the surface looked polished and unremarkable again. They were my scalpel. Tonight, however, I wasn't looking for a surgical strike. I was looking for an amputation. Young-ho emerged from the back bedroom, his expression shadowed. She's asleep. I gave her some of the sedative from the kit. She won't wake up when the door hits the floor. Good, I said, standing up. My chair scraped against the linoleum, a harsh, discordant sound. The Namgu Syndicate thinks they can farm this neighborhood because they think we've grown soft on the local peace. They think a debt is just numbers on a page. We're going to remind them that in this district, The only debt that matters is the one paid in respect. I walked toward the door, my coat billowing slightly. The transition from neighbor to warlord was complete. The biggest man wasn't just a protector anymore. He was a storm. As we stepped back into the hallway, the flickering light above finally died, plunging the corridor into a thick absolute black. In the darkness, I could hear the distant roar of engines. My men, the cleaners, the shadows I had summoned, all converging on a single point in the city. The hunt had been called. I could almost feel the fear beginning to ripple outward from this small, broken apartment, traveling through the phone lines and the back alleys until it reached the hearts of the men who thought they were safe behind their notarized threats. I reached into my pocket and felt the small plastic hair clip Minicio had dropped in the hallway earlier. It was a cheap pink thing shaped like a flower. It felt impossibly light against the heavy weight of the world I was about to break. "Let's go," I said. "I want the ledger on my table before the sun comes up." The air in the basement of the Namgu logistics hub was stagnant, smelling of damp earth and the metallic tang of industrial grease. It was a space designed for forgetting, a concrete tomb where the syndicate kept the collateral that didn't fit into ledgers. I stood at the top of the metal stairs, watching the red glow of my cigarette ember pulse in the dark. Below, the sounds of a muffled sob and the rhythmic thud of a heavy boot against flesh drifted up, followed by a coarse, mocking laugh. I didn't give a signal. There was no need. My cleaners moved like a single organism, a tide of black fabric and suppressed steel. Young-ho went first, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He reached the bottom of the stairs before the guards even looked up. The first man died with a confused look on his face. His throat collapsed by a silent precision strike. The second didn't even have time to reach for the pistol tucked into his waistband before Kite's blade found the gap between his ribs. The violence was short, ugly, and terrifyingly efficient. It wasn't a fight, it was an eviction. I descended the stairs slowly, my boots clicking rhythmically against the metal treads. In the center of the room, under a single flickering bulb, Minacio's mother was zip-tied to a rusted pipe. Her husband, the man who had traded his family's safety for a seat at a table that would never have him, was huddled in the corner, his face a mask of blood and cowardice. Two Namgu runners were still standing, backed against a wall of filing cabinets, their hands raised in a belated, trembling surrender. "Where are the contracts?" I asked, my voice echoing in the low-ceilinged room. One of the runners, a boy barely old enough to shave, pointed a shaking finger at a heavy iron safe in the corner. "In there. We just watched the door. We don't have the code." I didn't look at him. I looked at Ji-young. She was shivering, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at me as if I were a new kind of monster come to replace the old ones. I walked over to her, the biggest man in a room full of broken things, and produced a small pocket knife. With a single fluid motion, I sliced through the plastic restraints. "Go to the car," I said, my voice softening just enough for her to hear. "Young-ho will take you back to Minacio." She didn't move at first, her breath hitching in her chest. Then she looked at her husband, who was whimpering in the shadows. For a moment I saw a flicker of the woman she used to be, a flash of righteous, cold anger. She didn't offer him a hand. She didn't even give him a second glance. She stood up, her legs wobbling, and walked toward the stairs without looking back. I turned my attention to the safe. "Kite, open it. Use the thermal lance." The hiss of the torch filled the basement, throwing long jagged shadows against the concrete. Within minutes the heavy door groaned open, revealing stacks of manila folders, thousands of lives reduced to interest rates and repayment schedules. I grabbed the folder marked with Minacio's address and handed the rest to Kite. "Burn the building," I said. "I want the Namgu syndicate to wake up tomorrow and realize they don't own a single soul in this district." I walked over to the father, who was still cowering on the floor. I grabbed him by the collar, hoisting him up until his feet dangled inches off the ground. He smelled of fear and cheap liquor. "You told your daughter I was the biggest," I whispered, my face inches from his. "But you're the smallest man I've ever met. If I see you within 5 miles of that apartment block again, I won't send the cleaners." I'll come myself. I dropped him like a sack of refuse. He scrambled away into the darkness, a rat seeking a hole. As we stepped back out into the night, the first wisps of smoke began to curl from the basement windows. Behind us, the paper mill was becoming a furnace, the predatory deaths of 100 families turning into ash and rising toward the stars. I reached into my pocket and touched the pink hair clip. The storm had passed, but the air felt cleaner than it had in years. The neon sign of the 24-hour noodle shop hummed with a low, comforting buzz, casting a warm amber glow onto the rain-slicked sidewalk. It was the kind of place where the steam from the large vats of broth acted as a veil against the harshness of the outside world. Inside, tucked into a corner booth far from the window, sat Minacio and Jiyoung. I paused at the door, adjusting my coat to hide the soot on my sleeves and the weariness in my eyes. I had spent the last hour ensuring the Namgu embers were thoroughly doused and that the police, tipped off by Detective Han, were busy processing a gang-related arson that would keep them occupied for weeks. When I stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed softly. Minacio's head snapped up. When she saw me, her entire body seemed to decompress, her small shoulders dropping an inch. She didn't run to me, she was too careful for that, but her eyes followed me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. Jiyoung looked up too. She was clean now, her hair pulled back, though the bruises remained as a fading testament to the life she had left behind in that basement. I slid into the booth across from them. A waiter, sensing the gravity of the table, set down a bowl of steaming janchiguksu in front of me without a word. Is it over? Jiyoung asked, her voice barely audible over the bubbling of the broth vats. It's over, I said, my voice steady. The debt is gone. The papers are ash. And the men who held them won't be coming back to this neighborhood. Not tonight, not ever. I looked at Minacio. She was staring at her bowl, stirring the noodles slowly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small crumpled bag of candy she had dropped during our first meeting. I placed it on the table between us. You dropped this, I said. I thought you might want it back. She looked at the colorful wrappers, then up at me. A small tentative smile flickered across her face, the first real light I had seen in her eyes. She took a piece of the strawberry hard candy, unwrapped it and popped it into her mouth. I knew you were the biggest, she whispered, her voice muffled by the sweet. I reached back into my coat and pulled out a small thick card. It was plain black, made of heavy PVC, with nothing but a gold-embossed dragon coiled around a single phone number. It carried no name, no address, and no title. In this city, among the people who moved in the shadows, it was more valuable than a diplomat's passport. I slid the card across the table to Jiyoung. She touched the embossed gold with a trembling fingertip. If anyone ever comes to your door again, I said, my voice dropping to a tone of absolute finality. If anyone so much as raises their voice in the hallway, you call that number. You don't call the police. You call me. Jiyoung looked at the card, then at me, her eyes filling with tears. She understood. This wasn't just a phone number. It was a shield. It was the weight of my entire organization, my reputation, and my life, distilled into a piece of plastic. By giving it to her, I was declaring this family, this broken, resilient pair, under my personal protection. Why? She asked, her voice breaking. We have nothing to give you, Ajushi. I looked at Minacio, who was now leaning her head against her mother's shoulder, finally safe enough to be tired. I thought of the man I had been before I moved into 402, a man who thought he could live without a heart if he just stayed quiet enough. You gave me something tonight, I said, standing up. You reminded me that being big doesn't mean anything if you don't stand tall for someone else. I left the noodle shop before they could thank me further. The cool night air felt different now, no longer a shroud but a clean slate. As I walked back toward the apartment block, the streetlights seemed a little brighter. I wasn't a hero and I wasn't a good man, but as I touched the empty space in my pocket where the candy had been, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 10 years has a way of smoothing the jagged edges of a man's soul, even if the world around him remains as sharp as a razor. In the high-rise office overlooking the neon pulse of the city, The air no longer smelled of wet concrete or cheap soju. It smelled of expensive cedarwood and the ozone of high-end air purifiers. I sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, my hands, older now, the scars faded into a silver map of my history, resting on the cool surface. The maps on the walls had changed. They were no longer hand-marked sketches of tenement blocks and dockside alleys. They were intricate, digital displays of logistics routes, legitimate real estate holdings, and legal corporate structures. I had moved the organization into the light, or at least a very profitable shade of gray. But in the center of that wall of power, between a framed deed to a harbor terminal and a map of the city's new transit lines, hung a small, simple wooden frame. It didn't contain a diploma or a commendation from the mayor. Inside, pressed flat against a cream-colored mat, was a single faded strawberry candy wrapper. The plastic was crinkled, the red ink slightly bled at the edges, but to me it was the most important document in the room. It was the anchor that kept me from drifting back into the cold, purposeless shadow I had once called home. A soft chime echoed from the intercom. "Sir, your 4 o'clock is here. She says she doesn't need an appointment." I felt a ghost of a smile tug at the corner of my mouth. "Send her in." The heavy oak door swung open, and a young woman stepped into the room. She was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit, her hair pulled back in a professional knot. She carried herself with the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having to wonder if she belongs in a room. She was a rising star in the prosecutor's office, a woman known for her relentless pursuit of the very kind of predatory lenders who had once haunted her childhood. "You're late, Minicio," I said, my voice gravelly but warm. "I had to finish a deposition," she replied, walking toward the desk. She didn't look at the maps or the expensive art. Her eyes went straight to the small frame on the wall. She stood before it for a moment, her expression softening into something private and ancient. "You still have it." "It's a reminder," I said, "of the best deal I ever made." She turned back to me, and for a split second, the polished prosecutor vanished, replaced by the 10-year-old girl who had stood in a flickering hallway and asked a giant for a miracle. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, familiar-looking plastic card, the black and gold protection card I had given her mother a decade ago. It was scratched and worn, the gold leaf nearly gone from years of being carried like a talisman. "I don't think I need this for protection anymore, Ajeshi," she said, placing it gently on my desk. "I have the law for that now. But I wanted to return it in person." I looked at the card, then at her. She had become the biggest person in her own right, not through violence or shadows, but through the fierce, bright clarity of justice. My protection was no longer a shield she hid behind. It was the foundation she had built her life upon. "Keep it," I said, sliding the card back toward her. "Not because you need it, but because even the biggest people need to remember where they started." She laughed, a sound that was light and free of the echoes of the tenement. She picked up the card, tucked it into her wallet, and then reached into her pocket. She leaned over the desk and placed a fresh, bright red strawberry candy next to my hand. "For the next time things feel small," she whispered. As she walked out of the office, her heels clicking a steady rhythmic beat against the marble floor, I unwrapped the candy. The scent hit me, sweet, artificial and perfect. I looked back at the wall, at the faded wrapper in its frame, and then out at the city I now helped run. The shadows were still there, they always would be, but as long as there were people willing to stand tall, the light would never quite go out. If this story made you feel something, please like the video and subscribe to this channel for more.